Ankelium Down, written by Nik Hein, narrated with the help of the AI. Chapter 3.
The new cell was no different from the old one, except Dams had it all for himself. Apparently, all the human cargo cells on the galleys were exactly the same. Indeed, why should there be any variety of places for those now considered not people, but property? In his previous life, Dams had flown on various galleys many times, but of course, he had occupied way more comfortable quarters for several people if he was on standard military transport, or single cabins if on couriers or reconnaissance frigates. Now, he had learned more about the inner workings of the galley than ever, and certainly more than he would have liked. And in truth, it was also an additional cause for concern. What awaited him? Dams knew that in the last 10 years, the imperial courts had imposed death sentences only in the most extreme cases, and those were never actually carried out. The emperor usually commuted them to life imprisonment. Officially, this was explained by the softening of morals and the humanization of society and the justice system. But Dams knew better than anyone that hard labor in the Ankelium mines, and even more so in the galleys, was just a more sophisticated method of capital punishment. But why didn't the curator simply order to throw Dams out of the airlock? All his former honors and decorations were worthless now. Dams had known far more deserving officials and military men who had been stripped of everything in an instant and reduced to the status of cargo, as the curator had recently put it. Dams did not have an answer to that question. Quite unexpectedly, the boredom became a serious problem for him. There was nothing in his cell but a bunk, a sink with a faucet, and a toilet. Food, standard army rations, was handed to him thrice daily through a special dispensing window in the cell door. No books, no terminal, even a simple one, and of course not connected to any external network, not even a piece of paper and a pencil. The conditions, strictly speaking, were not very different from those in the Camp Gratitude, but without all the extras. Back there, after a shift, you either fell asleep or had another session of abuse from the overseers. Either way, there was no time to be bored. Here on the galleys, there was nothing to do. So much so, in fact, that even Dams, who was used to the army barracks routine, quickly found it a burden. He did push-ups, pumped his abs, and generally kept fit as best he could, but it helped only partially. Naturally, his free time was gradually occupied by memories. But he didn't want to remember his life before the trial. That life no longer had any meaning because there was no return to it, and there could be no return. As it always happens in such cases, the only refuge for a man in sensory deprivation was his own mind. And yet, even after time in the labor camp, Dams remained too disciplined to simply withdraw into himself and lose himself in the labyrinths of his tormented mind, as was the case with most convicts. Instead, he reassessed and, as best he could, refreshed his memory of the events that seemed most important to him now and which he had once vowed to himself not to forget under any circumstances. For instance, the memory of Anton. Anton had gotten to Camp Gratitude about 3 months after Dams. By that time, Dams had already begun to fall into that senseless and silent stupor with which almost all convicts invariably end. Anton, however, managed to change that very quickly. Unlike Dams, Anton was a real rebel, more precisely, an underground dissident. In the modern empire, talking about a real revolution or rebellion was ridiculous. Although he was barely 19, he had, in the way, seen more in that short time than Dams had seen in his entire service. The life of constantly moving through safe houses and secret bases had begun for Anton literally from birth. Both his parents were veterans of the resistance. Both, like Anton, possessed the ability to resist the will of members of the Imperial family. The Underground, however, called this ability the will to freedom. Their section, one of the last still remaining free in the domain of the Imperial family, held an almost religious belief that the will to freedom, that is, the ability to resist the mental attacks of members of the Imperial family, could be nurtured, trained, or otherwise achieved. Dams found it a bit strange, considering the fact that Anton's father himself came from a side branch of the Imperial genetic line and had even undergone prenatal Ankelium treatment, like all his relatives. But Anton swore that his father had never even for a second considered using his abilities to force new supporters or get any other benefits for the Underground. It was hard to believe, of course, but given the sad end of the Underground, that was probably the reality. Dams did not want to ask him about the circumstances of the arrest of the Underground, and Anton had never touched on the subject, but Dams realized that most likely it was not without agents provocateurs embedded in the Underground. From his point of view, it was foolish. Why not use these capabilities for good, if only to avoid failure? Just to probe lightly into each new recruit. But things went the way they did, and Anton ended up in Camp Gratitude. It took Anton about 2 weeks to tell Dams this story. Both of them, as particularly dangerous rebels, as if there were any other men in camp, were kept in separate solitary cells, and while working in the mine, conversations between prisoners were not encouraged. But the overseers did not stand continuously behind everyone's back, and sometimes it was possible to snatch a moment to have a word or two. Mostly, it was while they were pushing the ore car to the freight elevator, waiting until the supervisor in the loading area was out of sight, exchanging a few sentences, and falling silent again, eyes downcast, when the figure of another supervisor appeared around the corner. It was a strange and exhausting way to talk, but now it seemed to Dams that it was the most important conversation of his life. Later, after Anton's death, Dams sometimes wondered, why did this boy, whose weak body was full of frantic energy and unbending will, decide to trust him? It did not occur to Dams to hide his past. All the military tattoos were almost in plain sight anyway, barely covered by the tattered prison uniform. And yet Anton still told him the story of his life, even though the Underground was liquidated by the Imperial Special Units like the one in which Dams served. If fate had turned a little differently, Dams might have been the one who had put Anton in power shackles, stepping over his father's body. At first, Dams had thought Anton had chosen him as a potential protector from the other convicts. He had even tried to explain to Anton that aggression from other prisoners was perhaps the only danger in Camp Gratitude that did not need to be feared. All the convicts lived in small confinements and worked under the watchful eye of the overseers, who had no intention of sharing their right to violence with any former rebels, which right overseers exercised at every possible opportunity. The microchips implanted in each convict's head, obeying the signals of neural whips in the hands of the overseers, could play a whole symphony of pain in the body of each of the convicts, reaching a crescendo of any power, up to the maximum, leading to death. Anton was just coming off such another session, so he held on to the shiny, polished edges of the carriage only for looks. Dams was pushing it almost alone. "You don't understand," Anton said. "If I were afraid of anything, be it convicts, overseers, or the whole punitive machine of the Empire, do you think I'd be here? I chose you for another reason. You're not a zombie. You're not a puppet. You have brains of your own." Dams grinned. "Have you forgotten that I served in the elite Imperial Special Forces? Practically, my entire life has been spent in the glory of the Empire." "And where did that get you?" Dams fell silent. First of all, they were approaching the turn, and secondly, Anton's question hit him in the most painful place. Dams was well aware of the criteria of the Loyalty Act because, as a Special Forces officer, he was involved in its implementation. But as a Special Forces officer, he encountered only those who deliberately went against the law, like Anton and his father's underground fighters. And sometimes worse, crazy terrorists, founders of bloodthirsty cults, and the like, were not particularly regrettable. Those who suddenly found themselves as subjects to the biological section of the Loyalty Act were dealt with by the local police or even by the health system, because, most often, it was discovered at some trivial medical examination, or sometimes in a totally random situation, like Dames himself. "Do you really think we have a chance of ever getting out of here?" Dams asked on the next run. "Who knows?" Anton replied. "Nothing lasts forever, not even empires." Dams grinned, though he knew that in the semi-darkness of the mine, Anton would hardly see it. "The empire is several hundred years old. We don't have any opponents unless you count small cells of insurgents, and those are practically finished. I'm sorry, I don't see any reason for big changes since most of the empire's population is doing just fine. The Roman Empire also existed for almost 1,000 years. And where is it now?" Anton replied. "As for apologizing, I'm not offended. You are right after all. Most people are happy. But what about you and me? Or slaves in the galleys? Are you overflowing with happiness?" Another pause to load the cart. "I don't have an answer to your question except one," Dams said. "There's no such thing as everybody being happy. Someone will always hold some sort of grudge, and a harmonious society's task is to ensure that these dissatisfied people do not harm others." He immediately sensed how Anton, despite his weakness, was pushing the cart as hard as he could. Dams knew what it meant. His companion was angry. "You're pouring it on like a textbook," Anton said. "But life is not like them. Tell me, the faithful warrior of the Empire, if you were not here with me now, what harm could you do to others?" Once again, Dams could not find an answer. It was another question that had plagued him almost since his arrest. Could his insensitivity to the orders of members of the Imperial Family somehow negatively affect his loyalty to the Empire? He had asked it 1,000 times, and each time, he invariably came to the same conclusion: no. Even now, in the Empire's worst prison, from which there was no return for anyone, he still had no hatred or even dislike for the system that had sent him here. He had simply been unlucky. Perhaps it was the fatalism inherent in all soldiers. Dams was used to taking life as it came, not delving too deeply into its philosophical nooks and crannies, going by the straightforward military way of living. But then there was an unexplained dark side to all of that. Take the labor camps, for example. Doesn't the Empire have the proper machinery to exploit Ankelium deposits? Why use such a ridiculously ancient method as manual labor of prisoners? After all, the industrial ways can increase production literally thousands of times. When he asked Anton about this on another shift, the boy only grinned sadly and shook his head. Dams noted that the young revolutionary looked worse and worse every day. Of course, penal servitude does no one any good, but some people were destroyed by it at a terrifying rate. Don't you think these bloodsuckers themselves would like to swarm the Venus, Mercury, and Saturn satellites with modern equipment, to deploy large-scale mining, and to throw the scum like you and me into a vacuum or send us to the galleys? Dams winced, as he did every time Anton insulted the Imperial Family. "I'm sure our dearest emperor just sleeps and sees how to pull off such a clever maneuver, except that the Ankelium has its own opinion on the matter. Anton said. Dams almost stopped in surprise. Actually, to do so was fraught with very unpleasant consequences. The overseers knew to the second how much time each pair of convicts took for each particular action. For example, to push a cart from point A to point B, any infraction was most often punished with a neural whip. Not during the shift, of course, so as not to reduce output. Torture was reserved for the night. Wait, what do you mean? Dams asked, pushing the cart with redoubled vigor. What does Ankelium have to do with it? How can it affect the mining methods? It's just a rare mineral. Anton, who almost lost his balance from Dams's sudden hiccup, quickened his step. Look at you, guardian of the Empire, he said, without his usual sarcasm, but rather with a deep sadness. Do they even teach you anything in this academy of yours? Something unexpected snapped Dams out of his thoughts. Even after months of hard labor and monotonous colorless life in a cell on the galley, the old reflexes still worked. Dams lay motionless on the bunk for a while, listening to his sensations, then sank to the floor and put his cheek to the cold metal. There it was. The barely perceptible light tremor of the galley's complex machinery was interrupted from time to time by irregular pushes. Not too strong either, but Dams had enough experience to know what it could mean. Some small ship had docked with the galley, perhaps even more than one, and now the whole system should align around a new common center of mass. All in all, there was nothing unusual about it. It could be a courier boat. After all, there was a representative of the Imperial Family on board the galley, or some kind of supply ship. Though by Dams's estimation, the galley was still far enough away from the numerous bases and stations in the vicinity of Earth. He could be wrong. He was a soldier, not a navigator. He listened for a while longer, then went back to his bunk. The memory session had lost its vividness, but his mind still replayed much of what Anton had said that day, especially those things that Dams did not want to remember at all. Gradually, he plunged back into the past. According to Anton, the Empire depended equally on the rebels as on the Ankelium itself. The mysterious mineral, consisting of the matter for which there was no place in the periodic system of elements, affected any complex mechanisms, disabling them with incredible speed. Batteries were discharged, processors and memory crystals irrevocably lost their internal structure, and optic fiber lost its structure and became useless. It was also affecting people. Everyone knows that, Dams said. The dynasty's founder once discovered this influence of Ankelium and found a way to use it to change himself and lay the foundations of the empire. That's from the school textbook. Anton grinned contemptuously. He discovered it, huh? Found a way to use it. That's one pompous way to describe it. He was just lucky. He was an ordinary engineer in a research team working on Venus. Not so far from us, by the way, although the Camp Gratitude was built over another Ankelium deposit. When all the members of the expedition, except him, went mad and started killing each other, he hid in a garbage container. Then he crawled out of there, stepping over the bodies of his colleagues, and eventually somehow managed to piece the facts together. Just before the chaos started, they got the first samples of Ankelium. To his credit, he even figured out why all the instruments were showing nonsense and took most of the Ankelium back to the mine. But I think he also went a bit off the rails. How else to explain his crazy idea to make an Ankelium serum and inject it into his brain, and then establish the most overwhelming dictatorship in the history of mankind? Of course, they don't write that in the textbooks, but don't forget, my father is also a member of the Imperial Family. He managed to dig up a thing or two in the family archives. It took Anton several days to tell this story, not only because he could only tell it in short snippets, but also because he was constantly interrupted by dams, who at first did not believe a single word. But the pieces continued to fit into the puzzle, creating a single, logical whole, strikingly different from the picture of the world Dams was accustomed to. From Anton's words, it turned out that there were different levels of human susceptibility to the Ankelium. For the vast majority, it was destructive. The psyche was rapidly going to pieces, memory and the basics of personality were deteriorating, and the person either turned into a maddened clot of aggression or fell into a catatonic stupor. However, some people could resist this influence, and very few could use it to amplify their psychic abilities to incredible limits. That's why, strange as it may sound, the Empire needs rebels, Anton said. People immune to the abilities of members of the Imperial genome, it is inaccurate to call this subspecies family, and therefore immune to some extent to the effects of Ankelium. Ankelium is the blood of the Empire, and someone has to mine it. Dams pondered. What about the overseers? Are they rebels too? Anton grinned, and Dams was amazed at how much hatred Anton managed to put into that grin. Not exactly, the young rebel said. Mostly they are relatives of the Emperor. Dams even stopped for a moment in surprise. How do you mean? Simple. The Emperor's gene clan includes several tens of thousands of people. Of course, they all receive proper training and treatment, but there are scoundrels among them as well. Not the great evil like our beloved Emperor, but something more mundane. Criminals, thieves, rapists, murderers, you name it. Dams was so stunned that Anton laughed. In the hopeless, despairing atmosphere of the mine, the merry laughter sounded especially strange. Buddy, the Imperial family are still very much humans, with the same virtues and vices, Anton said. Of course, it's much rarer in the inner circle of the Emperor, and if somebody of his close relatives gets caught red-handed, they deal with them differently. But the rest end up here. Have you ever wondered why they hate us so much? They're prisoners here just like us. That was their last conversation. The next day, Dams was paired with another man, a terrified, trembling ex-accountant. Dams thought that if it had not suddenly occurred to the accountant to purchase VIP tickets for the festivities in honor of the Crown Prince's visit, he might well have lived his whole life, without even realizing that, according to the biological subsection of the Loyalty Act, he was an antisocial element subject to lifelong isolation. It was useless to ask the poor guy anything. All the more so when it came to the overseers. The answer to any question was always the same: a pain session with the neural whip. At first, Dams thought that Anton had been transferred somewhere or was not feeling well. But as the days and weeks passed, Dams gradually realized that he would never see Anton again, neither he nor anyone else. And then, Clovel was appointed as a new senior overseer of the row where Dams's cell was located. Unlike his predecessor, Clovel really liked to talk, especially about the fate of the disappeared convicts. The ship shuddered once more, finally interrupting the flow of unhappy memories. Of course, Dams was no navigator, but it didn't feel like a course correction. But then what? His brain, accustomed to quickly analyzing the situation and making instant decisions, was having a hard time getting to work. The ceiling lamp flickered, then went out for a few seconds, and when it came back on, its light was barely enough to disperse the darkness. It was strange and unexplainable. Dams stood up and walked over to the massive panel of the entrance. It was impossible to open the door from the inside, nor the small window through which the people in the cells received their food. Everything was controlled from the outside. Even the window wasn't really a window. It was a small airlock whose inner door would only open after the outer door closed. If needed, the prisoner could always be sedated by simply feeding sleeping gas through the vent. The lights continued to flicker, the subtle vibrations beneath his feet telling him that the ship was continuing some obscure maneuvers. Dams put his palm to the door panel, then pressed his cheek against it. There. Even through the solid metal of the door, something could be felt. Moreover, Dams thought he even heard some vague noises outside, but perhaps it was just the play of his senses, tired from long sensory deprivation. Dams knocked on the door several times. In any other situation, he wouldn't have done so. At Camp Gratitude, such an act guaranteed prolonged close contact with the neural whip. On the ship, the guards were not as prone to sadism as the camp overseers. Most likely, they would have simply left Dams's act unanswered. But something unusual was clearly going on now. Dams looked up at the small camera in the ceiling next to the light fixture, an ever-shining light source and a never-sleeping eye. Dams knew that the images from such cameras were processed by special software that recorded any unusual behavior of the prisoners. If someone, for example, tried to drown himself in the steel toilet in the corner, the program would instantly issue an alarm to the central console of the prison block, and then safety protocols would be initiated by the senior guard. Either gas through the vents or a couple of guards with neural whips. What was going on? Suddenly, Dams felt a leaden heaviness, so heavy that his knees shook, and immediately afterward, an unusual lightness, as if he'd lost half his weight at once. It was as if he were not standing in a standard prison cell on a galley, but in an elevator, which had rushed upward and then began to descend rapidly. But Dams knew what such swings meant. Something was wrong with the ship's gravity generator. Eventually, after a few jumps, the gravity returned to standard. But it was clear to Dams that something unusual had happened, or was still happening, on the galley. He took a quick look around the squalid surroundings of the chamber. There was nothing that could be used as a weapon, or at least to attract immediate attention. Other than the bedding, toilet paper, and prison clothes Dams wore, everything in the cell was permanently attached to the walls and floor. Even the soap and toothpaste came from dispensers embedded in the wall. Dams was sure that no one was watching him now. The control program must have already reported to the central console that a prisoner from one of the cells was standing at the door, listening intently to what was happening on the galley. He was still lost in speculation when the lights flashed again, and then the massive door slid aside, opening a way out.